Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. In the last video we went over looping and you got to see like the for each method on arrays, which allowed us to use a function to loop over an array with a function. Say, hey, run this function for each item on the array. Now this pattern where you take a function that exists, so in this case for each is a function that's built into JavaScript that requires a function. So it's built to receive a function. This is referred to as a callback. So we're going to do in this video is talk more about callbacks. The whole idea here is just that a function uses a function. Okay. So we'll make a file called callbacks.ts. And the whole idea here is this: you have a function, so we'll call this the parent function. Parent function. And this parent function receives one argument. So we'll say the argument is another function. Now this particular parent function, we're going to say, because again, we always want to type things as specifically as we can, we're going to say it expects a function that takes no arguments, so empty parentheses, that returns a number. Okay, so that's what this function expects. And basically the return value will be the value that a returns, which should be a number. So let's actually specify that. So this function should return a number. Again, if you wanted to write this in JavaScript, you just take up the type annotation, so it would just literally just be like A, and this would just return, and this would just wouldn't be there. Okay, so again, what's the difference between TypeScript and JavaScript? JavaScript is just TypeScript without the type annotations. Same thing. Okay, so that's what this is. So this function is going to receive one argument, which is a function, and the function itself should return a number. Okay, so let's write a function that we can pass to this function. So we'll say child function, and this function takes no arguments, but will return a number, and we're just going to say, hey, it returns 5 arbitrarily. Okay, cool. So now I could actually sit there and say, like, we'll console.log the result. We'll say, hey, if we use the parent function, passing it the child function, and see everyone's happy because the parent function is being called. It's receiving one argument, which is child function, and child function is a function that takes no arguments and returns a number. Okay, so it meets the type definition. This function meets the definition of what a should be. Okay, so technically now when we call parent function, it's going to call a, which a is going to be whatever function we pass in, which happens to be child function. So calling a is the same thing as me calling child function, which is going to return 5. So then 5 gets passed to the parent function's return value. So this is just going to end up being 5. So if I do Deno run callback.ts, I get back 5. Okay, and I don't have to write a whole separate function like that. I could also do this, like console.log parent function, and then define the child function right in the argument. So I can say, okay, here's a function that takes no arguments that will return the number 5. Okay, and that technically is a function that takes no arguments and returns a number. So technically this ends up becoming a. Well, actually, let's make it a different value though, 7. Okay, so that's because basically when you write an arrow function and you don't include the curly brackets, this is treated as like the word return. So I'm saying, hey, this input will return this output. Okay, that's essentially how that reads when you don't put the curly brackets. If I did include the curly brackets and I did this, then I would have to actually write return 7, because now it's going to expect a explicit return value. Okay, just so you know. So again, without curly brackets, the word return is assumed. With curly brackets, then I actually have to explicitly say, hey, this is the return value. But again, this function, okay, I could have also written it like this. I could have also done this. Function parentheses return 7. And see, like that. So technically there I'm passing a function. So there's different ways to write the function right there. So the idea is I don't have to separately write this whole function and then pass in the name like I did here. I could define the function, but typically you'll do it with an arrow function. So you'll typically see something like this because it's just a lot less typing. Okay, see, like that's nice and succinct. Okay, And again, this is a function, takes no arguments, returns a number, which is exactly the way we defined this function. So that's all a callback is. It's just a function. Some functions expect to receive a function, and the name of that function you pass in is called a callback. Because the idea is that when that function decides to, they'll call the function. Okay. Cool. Now, the reason why this callbacks are particularly important is because arrays have a lot of really cool functions that are pretty useful. Okay, so we already saw for each. Okay, so for each, all it does is loops over the array and runs the function for each item. Okay, so let's create a array to work with. So let's say const my array, which this will be an array of numbers. And we're going to say equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and wait. Well, let's complain because I have another my array in a different file. Fine. So we'll just say my array 1 just to get rid of that syntax highlighting. Okay, so we have my array 1. That's all looks fine and good. Okay. So let's say my array 1 dot for each. So you saw this before, that I could pass as a function. But again, as you saw earlier, I don't have to predefine the function. I could just define the function right in there. And as I mentioned before, this function will always receive 2 items, 2 things. Or technically it receives 3 arguments because it has this third argument, which is the array. But I've never needed that. So essentially we're going to say, hey, the item, which is going to be a number, because it's one of the items from the array. So since this is an array of numbers, that's always going to be a number. And then the index, which should be a number in this case. And then the function should, so curly brackets, then I can write what I want the function to do here. So I say, hey, I want this function to literally console log each item. So when I run this for each function, it's going to take the function that I defined in here and then one by one say, okay, let me take the item, which is 1, pass that to the function, pass in the index, which is 0, which I didn't use. So again, just to make sure that I use it, we'll just console log the item and the index. So we'll just say, use backticks. Okay, item. Okay, item, using interpolation. Index. Okay, now when I run the code, so if I say like Deno run callback.ts, so you see a loop through the index, a loop through each item in the array. So the first item was 1, then 2, and then it's also receiving the index. So the index of the first item is 0, the second item's index is 1. Okay, and again, how do I know this? How do I know that those are the 2 arguments I bring in here? Well, I could just hover over for each and see it tells me. So it says like, hey, there's this for each function that's built into arrays. And the first argument, it takes 1 argument, which is the callback. The callback function is a function that takes in 3 arguments: the value, which we call the item, index, which we still called index, array, I didn't define it because I wasn't planning on using it, and returns nothing because it doesn't need. You'll see like this doesn't return anything. Okay, and yeah, that is how that one works. Now there's a couple other ones that are really, really important, so such as map. Map is probably one of the most important functions that you'll use a lot, especially if you get into like React development later on. But really, I use map all the time. It's just such a brilliant function. What this does, it's going to run a function on each item in the array and return a new array of the return value. So every time it runs a function, whatever that function you give it returns gets put into a new array. So for example, if I were the console.log my array 1.map, and then I would just say, hey, item, again, item is going to be number, index will be a number, because again, we're dealing with a number array, so the item is always a number. Again, the item will always be the type of whatever's in the array. So if it was a string array, I would just say string. and I want to return the item plus 1. So I'm going to say loop over each item and then return whatever that item is plus 1. Okay, and again, this function will return a number. I should be explicit about that. And again, this one returns nothing, so that would be void. It's always good to be specific. Okay, it just allows your code to be, you're more likely to catch bugs that way. Okay. Cool. So if I run this, what's going to happen is that it's going to loop over each item. So it'll go over the first item, which is going to return the item, which is 1 plus 1. So it'll return 2, then 3, then 4. It keeps going down each item. And I'm going to get a new array, which is going to look like the same array, but everything plus 1. And see, there it is. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, I can do whatever I want. The idea is that, let's say I needed, like, you know, let's say I have a list, a bunch of first names and last names, but I want to just turn them into, like, a name. I can use map to map over each item in the array and turn them into strings if I want. Okay, so map is pretty awesome because there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to have a lot of arrays of data, and you're saying, hey, I want this array of data to look like this, not like what it looks like now. Map is the way to do it. So you can go over each item in the array and say, okay, do the same change to each item in the array and then give me the new array. So again, it's not mutating the original. None of these callback functions ever change the original array. Let me just think about that one for a second. For the exception of sort. But none of these, they usually will return you a new array or a value, but they'll never change, which is why these functions tend to be pretty awesome. So that's what map does. So map is going to return you an array based on whatever the function you give it returns. So since this function returns whatever that item is plus 1, the new array is just, you know, the items in the array plus 1. Then there's filter. Okay. So if I were to do filter, okay, yeah, let's do filter. What this does is going to return a new array of only items in which the function returns true. So essentially what I'm trying to do is say, hey, I want to remove items that don't meet. So essentially what the idea is that I'm going to write a function that's going to return true or false. Whenever it returns true, that item will be included in the array that filter returns, and if not, then it doesn't get included. Okay. So if I do console.log my array 1.filter, and let's say I only want the even numbers. Okay, that's all I want. I can be like item, so I do the parentheses, so item, which is going to be a number, index, which is going to be a number, and then this function will return whether item modulo 2 equals 0, because again, that's how we check if something is even. Because if the item number is divisible by 2, it's even. And again, this should return a Boolean. Okay, so that's what this function is going to return. Okay, so again, typing. And again, how would this look like in JavaScript? Same thing, just without the types. So again, I would just take off all these, like take off that, take off this, and then take off this. But now what that's going to do is going to go to each number and say, hey, is 1 even? If not, doesn't get included. So when I do, what it's going to do is going to return me an array of just the even numbers. And see, it's just an array of even numbers. Okay, you know, because if we take a look at the original array, 1's not even, 3's not even, 5 is not even. So we only end up with 2, 4, 6. Okay, it didn't change the original array, so I didn't modify the original array. What I did is I created a new array that's been filtered based on the original array. Okay, so that's very useful, especially like let's say you have like a big array of items, but you only need certain ones. I can then write a filter that'll reduce that to a smaller list. Okay. A couple other sort of low-hanging fruit ones are like sum and every. What they do is they're going to return true. They're going to return true or false. So they return true or false based on whether the callback function returns true some of the time or every time. So it depends on which one I'm using. So for example, console.log, first we'll test out sum. So we'll say, hey, my array1.sum, we give it a function. We'll literally use the same exact function as we did here, like is it even? So it'll return true or false based on whether it's even. So I'm just literally going to use the same function. So I'll just paste it in there. What we can actually do this, since we're going to use it multiple times, we can just make it we can just make a function. So what I'm going to do is that over here to make this simpler, okay, this is under filter, I'm just going to make a function called is it even, again, which is going to be a function that takes in item, which is a number, index, which is a number, and returns a boolean, and that's going to equal this function. Take away the parentheses there. What am I missing? A parenthesis somewhere? So is it function, is it even? Oh, because I use the function keyword, so I don't need to do that. So all I need to do is return item modulo 2, so is the item even, equal 0. Okay. Oh, I don't need this colon here because we know it's a function. So there we go. Okay, so see, I defined this is it even function. So now I can just like now pass that function in here instead, because there's no need to be writing that over and over again. So again, whenever you find that you're going to do the same thing over and over again, that's when it makes sense to just, instead of defining it here in the parentheses, just do it here so that way I can use it multiple times. So if I were to give sum, is it even, it's going to give me back true. Okay, that way is it saying comma. I have too many parentheses. There we go. Oh, I'm missing a parenthesis here. There we go. So we see now I'm still passing it that function, but again now I've just made it a named function, so I can just easily pass it in there. Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, sum, is it even? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the is it even function, and long as it returns true at least one of the times, at least if one of the numbers, so some of the numbers are even, then it should return true. Because the idea here is behind the sum function is I'm asking, are some of the numbers this? Based on the function that I pass in. So I'm saying, hey, is some of the numbers even? Which some of the numbers are even. Now console.log, every works the same way. The only difference is that it only returns true if every number passes the test. So if I do my array1 dot every is it even, let's see what the results are. So we run it and see are some of the numbers even? Yeah. Is every number even? No, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 3, 5 are not going to be even. So is it even is going to return false on those. And every only returns true if it returns true every time. That's why it's called every. So this is a great way if the question is, hey, is this thing true for every single thing in this array? Okay, and you want to try to figure if that's true or false. So that's a really, really, really kind of useful function. Then there's find and find index, which basically it's kind of like filter, where you're identifying it based on a function, but it's only going to return you one thing. So find will return, so instead of giving you a filtered list, it's going to either return the first item in which the function returns true. That's going to be for find. Or return the index of the first item that returns true. And again, I will upload this to GitHub, so that way you can take a look at all this code, and I will put that in the video description. First item that returns true. Okay, so let's see what happens if I do a find and find index using is it even. Okay, so we'll say find, because find should find us the first number that's even, and then find index should give me the number of the first item that is even. Okay, and so we just change these functions to find and find index. So instead of me defining the function in there, since I'm using the same function for all of these, that's where, again, having the function predefined makes my life a lot easier. Again, that whole don't repeat yourself. So instead of writing the same function over and over again, I'm able to just inject it there. That's the beauty of functions. Code that I'm going to use over and over again, I can sort of encapsulate into a function. Okay. So is it even? So again, find is going to go start with the first item in the array, which is 1, and then run it, pass it into that is it even function. So it should return false the first time, and then true the second time, and stop there, because that's the first. Once it finds the first one, it stops. That's different than filter, because again, it's not going to give us back an array of just the ones that matched. It's just going to find us the first one that matched. Find will give us back the actual number. Find index will give us back the index of that item. So you see, like, the first item that's even is 2, which happens to be the second item, which means 0, 1, the index is 1. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, also functions that I use fairly frequently, because you oftentimes may need to find something in an array. So first I will find the index of the item, and then I can go in there and like manipulate it or change it out or do something with it. Okay, cool. Especially if I need to like splice it out, I need to find the index first, so that way I can splice it. And then there's reduce. Reduce and sort are going to be the ones that generally confuse people a lot. Okay, so don't be alarmed if this really makes no sense up front. But what reduce does is just it takes an array of values and uses them to calculate one value. Okay, cool. That's essentially what it does. So think about it this way. Let's say we were to create a function called sum. Okay, so we want to add up a bunch of numbers. How would I add one number? Well, we'd have our running total, which would be technically the item. So that's going to be, but that's going to be a number. Okay, then we're going to have, so our running total, which is a number. Then we're going to have the item, which is also a number. We don't necessarily need the index, but I could define another argument that's the index, because again, this is still a callback. And all these array callbacks are pretty much work the same. It does take a while of practice to get used to these. These are probably one of the harder things to learn in JavaScript and really get comfortable with. And then this function will return a number. Okay, so essentially what I wanted to do is that every time this function is run, I want you to return the running total plus the current item. Okay, cool. So now what I can do is I can say, hey, console.log, I want to take my array and I want to reduce it to one value using the sum function. So I'm going to add everything up in the function, but I want you to start the running total at 0. This is referred, so again, this is essentially the running total, and I'm saying, hey, start it at 0. So for this array, for each item, what it's going to do is for the first item, the running total is 0, but the first item is 1. So then 0 plus 1 is going to be 1, and that becomes the running total for the next go around. So then the next one, the running total is 1, but the item is 2, so 1 plus 2 is 3. So that becomes the running total. So then the next loop, the running total is 3, and then this gets past 3, so it's 3 plus 3, which is 6. And it keeps doing that, and then returns the final result. So if I see this, it should return me the sum of all these numbers. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6. You can see that's our running total. 6 plus 4 is 10, 10 plus 5 is 15, which 15 plus 6 is 21. So I should get 21 at the end. And that's what we got, 21. Okay, so reduce, what you're doing is you're reducing it to one value. You're saying, okay, hey, do this thing to each thing in the array until you have one value, and I want you to give me back that value. So it's going to take a function, but the function is always the first argument is the running total, and then the second argument is going to be the item in the array. And what you're doing is the return value becomes the running total on the next loop. Okay, and again, yes, that is confusing. Once you really get comfortable with reduce, it's a really powerful function, but it takes some time to get used to. Okay, then there's sum. Sum is tricky. I'm debating whether we should really go over this here. I have a video on sum where I go over in depth. I think I want to recommend you look up that video. So search like Alex Merced sum, just because literally I could spend a half hour just describing how this particular function works, which it needs to do it justice. So look up that sum video. I'll go over it much more in depth there. But I'm going to wrap up this video here. So this is, again, the concept here is callbacks and array methods. So these were array functions that took callbacks, which means you gave them a function to do their job. So, if you're looking for more material on this, you would just search for array callback functions in JavaScript, Typscript, to find, again, more documentation, more examples of using things like map, filter, sum and every, find and find index, and so forth. But I'll see you all later on in the next video. Have a great day and enjoy.